Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Let's get this one off the ground. Go grab your coffee or grab a drink. Tell your family, friends, neighbors, and strangers the show is about to begin. Today we have a gentleman that has over 50 years in the business as a sportscaster of just about every sport imaginable. He's best known for being a boxing commentator, a Sam Taub Award recipient. He's an actor. He's covered 8 Olympic Games, Wimbledon, the Super Bowl, along with many others. A 4-time Emmy Award winner, born and raised in San Francisco, one of the very best in the business. It is my honor and privilege to welcome to the show, Barry Tompkins. Barry, thanks for taking time today to be with us.
Pleasure to be with you, Tommy.
We're just going to kick it off here. You grew up in the Richmond district in San Francisco, attended Washington High School. What were your early career aspirations at that time?
You know, at that time it was a little bit different. When I was a little kid, I wanted to do what I'm doing, actually.
Wow.
But by the time I was about 11 or 12 years old, I kind of gave up that ghost, and I wanted to be a cartoonist. I used to do a lot of drawing and that sort of thing. And so that was my ambition, was to be a cartoonist. And I never really thought much, quite frankly, about going into sports broadcasting. I was interested in the media. I wanted to do something in the media, but really most of my background was as a writer, and quite frankly, that's the thing that got me through school. I wasn't a great student, but I could usually put a few sentences together and make people believe I was telling them the truth.
Speaking of schooling, I found in some research in 1958, you attended, or I should say attempted to attend City College of San Francisco for a couple months. And the great line that I read was, you had a 1-point GPA, but you found that fascinating because you never attended.
Yeah, 1.6.
Oh, 6.
I want to correct that, 1.6. Yeah, I mean, I did. I took it as a badge of honor because I never went to class. So how do you get a 1.6 and never go to class? I took a couple of tests, and I guess I did okay on the tests. But yeah, I don't know. It's funny because many, many years later, 50 years later, I wound up teaching in college, and I still do. I teach at Dominican University, just up the road here from where I live, and I just teach one class. And in fact, I haven't even done that for the last couple of years, just because I don't have time for it. But my very first day in class, I told my students, I said, every time I walk into this classroom, I strike a blow against higher education, because this one period that I'm going to be in here is the longest time I've spent in a college classroom in my life. But the kids kind of like that, actually. And I really regretted not going to college for a long time. And now, quite frankly, I kind of take it as a badge of honor.
Yeah, and it's worked out well for you. But before we got into sports commentating, in 1959, you formed a singing group from some guys singing in the shower and called it the Embers. And is it true you really played the Apollo?
That's true. We really did. Yeah, that was my excuse for not going to college is that I was going to make $1 million in show business. And I fell something over $999,000 short. But
you were close.
Right in that ballpark. Yeah, we started singing. We were all on the track team in high school, and we sang in the showers after track practice. And in the shower, you sound pretty good. You can do 3-part harmony, and sounded pretty good. And that was back in the days of doo-wop. Actually started in 1957, and we had the interesting thing about it was we had a mixed race group back in the 50s, and that truly was, I always say that being on the road for a couple of years with this singing group was a better education for me than going to college, more useful in what I do, because I've been in a million different situations, and I'm pretty comfortable in whatever situation that I happen to be in, whether it's black tie or whether I'm in the middle of the inner city someplace, So it was quite an experience. Now, where I went to school, there really wasn't much of a thing called racism. I mean, every African-American person obviously experiences some of it. I hadn't really seen very much of it in high school because it was a great ethnic mix in my high school and we all hung out together. And so when we had this group, all of a sudden, we had one African-American, 3 of us were white, and we played in the South. We played in the Southwest, and some of the worst we saw was in New Mexico, actually. But even in New Jersey, we were in Wildwood, New Jersey, not far from Atlantic City. And come to find out, that's south of the Mason-Dixon line, and we ran into some real issues. So, and the Apollo was the opposite, where we were the great minority, and it was really eye-opening. It was really a great experience. Quite frankly, we weren't very good, but we had Johnny Mathis's brother, Ralph, was in our group. And Ralph could sing a little bit. I mean, we could all sing a little bit, but, in the great scheme of things and in the people that were really doing it in that time, they were way better than we were.
Eventually dissolves and you start getting into the broadcast industry. You had a 6-month stint at the U.S. with the U.S. Army, and where you started was KCBS, which was a client. And from there, you started. What was your position there with KCBS at the time?
I was hired as promotion director. Interestingly enough, I was in the advertising business, and I was writing copy for an advertising agency, and it was a very small agency. And I had I've always kind of thought of myself as a creative person, and so I had ideas about, at that time, the big advertising agency was Doyle Dane Bernbach. They had the Volkswagen account, and they did all these really clever things to sell Volkswagens, that it was an ugly little car. Their whole philosophy was you take the worst thing about a product and you turn it into the biggest sell. And so that really intrigued me, and I thought advertising would really be creative. Well, I worked for a small agency, and it was not creative, and the clients didn't want to see anything that they hadn't seen before. So the more you tried to be creative, the less you got done. And it just happened that KCBS Radio was my client. And even though I didn't write for them, but they were a client of ours. And I ran into the person that headed their whole communications department. And we kind of became friends. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come work for me? Write on-air promos, And so that's what I did. That's how I started as promotion director at KCBS Radio. And when I say director, the only person I was directing was me.
It's a great title, though.
Yeah, it was really good. Yeah. I liked it better than flunky.
Or you have singer in there, and we got a lot of things building on the resume. Yeah. And a few years later, and I'll let you tell the story. You're at lunch with a couple guys, and that kind of was somewhat of an ear popping thing for you, where you heard something and went, "Oh," and then that kind of opened up some more doors for you.
Yeah. That's the way my whole career, to be honest with you, I've been so lucky, Tommy, in the sense that, and I always say this, there were like literally 3 or 4 days in my career that changed my life. One of them was when the sports director at KCBS Radio hired me to do sports. And I think he only did that because I was such a pest. I was a huge sports fan at that time. And I grew up, his name was Don Klein. And I grew up listening. He used to do San Francisco Seals, which was the minor league baseball team in San Francisco. When I was a kid, he did Seals baseball. And so he was one of my heroes growing up, as a kid. And now here I am, I'm writing promos for Don Klein, and at that time, I was a huge sports fan. I grew up being a sports fan. I came from a sports family and grew up being a big sports fan. And so from the day I walked in the door at KCBS, I was right in Don Klein's ear, just saying, come on, let me write. He used to do a lot of commentaries. So I said, let me write your commentaries. Let me write some commentaries for you. I can do this. I know this. I love sports. And I'm sure he finally let me do it just to get me out of his face, And so I started writing commentaries for him, and he taught me how to do interviews. I'd never done an interview in my life. And he sent me out. I'd go out to the Warriors and the Giants and all the Bay Area teams and do interviews, post-game interviews, and he'd use them the next day. He wouldn't use my voice, but he would use my interview. And then after a time, I talked him into giving me a weekend, because on the weekends at that time, that was just a skeleton crew, a weekend college football show. And he said, yeah, if you can sell it, you can do it. So I got some Pontiac dealership in the East Bay over in Oakland to sponsor it. I think it cost him maybe $120, you know. And I read scores for an hour, literally read scores for an hour. That was my first on-air experience. So that was the one day in my life that Don hired me full time. And then the next one was the one you just spoke of. And that was, I was having lunch. It was in a different era. And I think people have to understand that. I always hesitate to tell the story of how I got started, because quite frankly, it just can't happen that way anymore. You know,
True.
In my class that I was teaching at Dominican University here, my students had a longer resume than I did. You know, I'd been in the business 50 years, but they all had internships from the time they were in high school. They all, you know, worked on crews, pulling cable or whatever they needed to do. So they all had resumes, and I had nothing, you know. So, but the reason I bring it up is at that time, you could be friends with the players and you could be friends with the managers and the owners because they were peers. You know, the players weren't making much more money than I was, and I wasn't making any money. You know, they all had off-season jobs. You know, they wanted to embrace the media because in some cases the media could help them. You know, if I showcase them, do a little thing on the radio or later on television, you know, that might help them get a commercial or whatever. And they were all looking for that kind of stuff. So it was easy to be friends. So there was a few people in my life when I first started, and again, I'm sure it's born of stupidity, you know, but when I first started, people just kind of adopted me because I really didn't know anything, you know, but I kind of knew how to behave. You know, I knew not to go barging into some place I really didn't belong, you know, and to wait until all the pros finished asking their questions and, you know, ask nicely, do you have time? Can I do, you know, that kind of thing. So there were a number of people, pretty well-known people who just kind of adopted me, you know, which I could tell you about later. But one of them was Franklin Muley, who was the owner of the Golden State Warriors. And because I was the youngest broadcaster in town by far, a lot of my peers, you know, were really helpful to me. And another one of those guys was Hank Greenwald, who was working for Franklin Muley. He was doing the Warrior games, some of the Warrior games with Bill King. And so he helped me in my career. So anyway, they both became friends. And I was having lunch with them one day. And Hank was 100% a radio guy. He hated television. You know, he didn't like to have walls or fences. He just wanted to go his own way. He's a very funny guy, actually. Years later, I wound up doing the Giants with him for a year. But anyway, so he tells me over lunch that he had just turned down a job at KPIX, which was the CBS television affiliate in San Francisco. And he writes name and a number down on a piece of paper. He said, why don't you call this guy? You know, maybe they're still looking, you know. So I went back to my office after that lunch and I called the name and number that were on the note that Hank gave me. And the guy answered the phone himself, no secretary, you know, nothing. And he said, when can you come over? You know? And I said, well, you know, I'm off work at whatever time it was. I don't remember. And he said, okay, come on over when you get off work. So I went over that same day. It's the same day I had lunch. I get off work. I go to KPIX. I go sit in his office. He said to me, do you have anything you can read? And it just coincidentally, I happened to have a script that I'd written for Don Klein, a commentary that I'd written for Don Klein in my briefcase. And so I told him, yeah, I wrote this for Don. And he said, read it, you know. So I read the commentary. It was about a 1-minute commentary. And he said, okay, 3 shows a day. You can start on whatever the day, January 1st, I think it was. And we'll pay $18,000 a year, which tripled my salary. You know? And that's how I got into television. Now, my first night on the air at KPIX, 5th biggest market in the country, my very first night on the air was the first time I'd ever been inside a television studio. I didn't know which end of the camera you looked through, honestly.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 27.
So your first time in front of the camera is that night.
That night.
Did they just kind of tell you where to look, or were you just winging it?
Well, I looked at the only inanimate object in the room, which was the camera, and of course, at that time it was guerrilla television. I mean, there was no teleprompters. There were no IFBs. I couldn't hear. I couldn't hear the control room at all. So all your communication is through a stage manager. No teleprompters, and of course, you got to play to the camera. So you can't really read a script. You kind of have to ad lib around it. You have to know what's in there and then ad lib around it. And that first night, I was so nervous. I think I always tell people I did a 3-minute telecast in about a minute and a half. And I never did sit down. I was bouncing off the chair. Like I'm sure the camera people tried to keep me in focus. That was the toughest job they ever had. That was my first night, and I thought for sure I'd get fired the second.
And how long did you end up staying there with KPIX?
I was there almost 7 years. I left there at the end of 1973.
So you kind of evolved, and then from 73 after that, is that when you moved to New York and joined WNBC TV? And how did that process happen for you?
It was a fluke also. My entire career has been a fluke.
I don't know if I'd say that.
No, well, it was opportunistic, I wound up in New York because of a friend, Tim Ryan. I don't know if that's a familiar name to you, but Tim was a longtime network broadcaster, and he had been in San Francisco doing the Seals hockey team, the Golden Seals they were called. So he was doing the television of the Golden Seals, and we became friends in San Francisco. And he left to go back to New York, and it was just ironic. All of the talent at KPIX, and we had been the number one station in town for years, and the numbers started to go down when Happy Talk News came in, and they didn't renew any of the talent contracts at the end of 1973. Everybody that was on the air was gone, and the management, everybody, complete clean house. So really, I had no idea. My plan was to stay there. I was never thinking about network television or anything like that. I wasn't even thinking about play-by-play. I hadn't done any play-by-play prior to that. So Tim called me and said, "We're looking for a summer replacement at WNBC. Are you interested?" And I thought, well, I don't have a gig, so why not? And I had family in New York, and I really liked New York, and so I thought, sure, I'll go and I'll see how it goes, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But they were going to pay me for 6 months, and so why not? So I went back there and worked at WNBC I actually worked at WNBC doing local news only for about a year. And it was a kind of the sports department there was sports room by committee. And the reason it was pretty high powered sports group. It was me, Tim Ryan, Marv Albert, and Dick Schaap.
Wow.
So we were the four talent there. And even the producers, one of the sports producers there wound up being the president of Discovery Channel. Another one wound up being a network director. And so there was a lot of people who went on to some pretty good things, in there. And so Marv was doing the Knicks and the Rangers, and Dick was writing books, and Timmy was doing the Islanders hockey. So it was kind of who's available tonight, to do the sports. So that's kind of how it worked. And at the end of the first year, the NBC Sports asked me if I could do some features, that kind of thing for them, because I'd always done a lot of features because I told you I'm a writer. So, and I never had a producer. My first 7 years in the business, the newsroom there was 42 people. And it was a very small newsroom for a big market station. Nobody had producers. The talent produced their own stuff, and so I wrote my own stuff, produced my own stuff for the whole time that I was at KPIX. And we had some very good film editors at KPIX, and I learned film editing from them, and learned how you look through a camera. I didn't shoot it, but I learned how to edit, how to put things together, how to produce it. So anyway, the Today Show asked me if I would do some features for them for their sports shows. Not the Today Show, I beg your pardon, NBC Sports. And then later the Today Show asked me to do features for them. So I still kind of had a foot in the door at WNBC, but for the most part, I was working for the network. And then the radio network asked me to do a series of weekend shows for them. And the deal was that we would travel to whatever the biggest sports event in the world was. That's where we would do the shows from. So I did that for 3 years, and I literally got to go to every major sports event in the world. I mean, literally, and it was a lot of fun. It was me and my producer. We were both single and crazy, and it was a ton of fun, And then that cut. They had big budget cuts, and after 3 years, they said, I don't think we're sending you to Paris for the Tour de France. So that kind of shriveled up and died. And at the same time, the NBC affiliate in San Francisco asked me if I could come back and do local sports for them and still keep my NBC contract. So I let the radio thing go. I was still doing features for NBC Sports and some for the Today Show, and came back and worked at KRON, which is the NBC affiliate here, for a couple of years. But I was gone almost all the time. That's kind of how it all evolved, and like I said, so much of it was just so fortuitous.
One of the couple of things that I found interesting, and as you said earlier, some of these things will never happen again. And one of them is this: you do the 1976 Olympics and you start calling the gold medals for Sugar Ray Leonard and Leon and Michael Spinks. Mm-hmm. And that's where you kind of started your broadcasting career, was at the Olympics. And then your first play-by-play for football is the Rose Bowl.
Yeah.
And your first tennis is Wimbledon. So you're at the biggest platforms of all these sporting events. And these are your first time doing these events. Yeah. I mean, was that just completely crazy, or are you just going with it?
Well, you got to go with it. Well, you know what it is? I have to say, prior to doing a Rose Bowl for NBC, I had done a couple of replay football games, where you do the game live and then they edit it, and it's we'll be back with more action after this. We move ahead to action later in the game. Those kind of things. So I did do some of that for both Cal and Stanford here in the Bay Area while I was still doing local news. But beyond that, no. So, I always tell my students this, and I've just kind of lived and died by it, and that is, if somebody asks you, have you ever done this? There's only one answer.
Yes.
Yes. And then you figure out how to do it, and, the difficult part is not saying yes or getting the gig. The difficult part is performing, actually doing it, and being asked to do it again.
Yeah.
So really that's always been my philosophy, and I've always been a pretty quick study. And, over the years, I've learned that I don't have to be, as a play-by-play guy, I don't have to be an expert. All I have to really know is the language of the sport and the rules, and who's in the game, or who's in first place if it's a race, whatever, and because I always have an expert sitting next to me, always, somebody who was very proficient at that particular sport. So I don't have to be an expert. Now over the years, I've done enough boxing and I've done enough basketball and I've done enough football, and I think I know what I'm looking at, but there are other sports I've had to do where literally, I one time at the Olympic Games, I had to go do the gold medal game in field hockey. I'd never not only had I have never done field hockey, I'd never seen a field hockey game. I always thought of it as full contact golf. I spent the morning reading the rules. I wrote out all the names phonetically. I came to the conclusion that you would call it the same way you would call soccer or hockey, neither of which I had called before. But certain games, hockey, soccer, field hockey, handball, are the same game basically. It's a goal in a net and however many players, and there's usually a penalty line, and So the way you call it is basically the same. Hockey's a little bit faster than soccer is, but basically you call it the same way. And the rules are different and the language is different. And that's really the most important thing. I can't do a tennis tournament and say that it's six love. I'd be exposed, So more than anything else, it's really learning the language and learning the rules, and even if you mispronounce somebody's name, do it consistently, don't change it,
Right.
So I don't know, you just kind of get by, you tap dance, and that was the case with boxing. Now boxing, my dad was a big boxing fan. And when I was a kid, he used to take me to fights, local fights, here in San Francisco. So I at least knew the sport, and I knew some of the history. And I thought, well, it's two guys. It's not like football. You got to remember 50 guys in boxing, it's two guys, and I thought, as far as calling it, if you know your left from your right, you should be able to do it.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Good left hand, good right hand.
Yeah. Right. You joined the HBO team with Larry Merchant and Sugar Ray Leonard eventually, and you've called over 200 championship fights. And before we go into some of the fights, Barry, how much preparation do you have to do before you start calling like some of these bigger fights you've done?
A lot. I don't have to tell you, you're a broadcaster. Preparation is the game. I mean, that's going on air and doing the show is the easiest thing that I have to do. It's all about preparation, and if you prepare right, I would say 90% of the time I'll wind up using about 25 to 30% of what I prepared. Now the time that you need to fill it, that's when when you look at the tops of your hands and there's sweat on the tops of your hands where you don't have sweat glands, that's when you need the fill material, and so even though 90% of the time you don't use 60% of the stuff that you prepare for, that other 10%, you really need it, so it's all about preparation. And in fact, like I probably did Marvin Hagler's last 15 fights. And yet every time I did a Marvin Hagler fight, I would have to study the same things all over again. Because I always did a lot of different sports. Mm-hmm. And if I was doing a basketball game on a Thursday and a football game on a Saturday and a fight on a Tuesday, I couldn't be thinking about the basketball game when I was doing boxing, and I couldn't think about boxing when I was doing football, So it literally was like a toilet at the end of every event. You just flushed it, and everything that you learned and everything that you studied that whole week is gone. So every time you do, even though it's the same guy, I have to read the same stuff and prepare the same notes and, hope to update it a little bit, but it's all preparation. I mean, my job is, the most difficult thing about my job is the preparation, not going on the air and doing the show.
Being on the air, you've done some famous calls, Alexis Arguello and Aaron Pryor, Hector Camacho, Edwin Rosario, Tyson winning over Trevor Berbick, Larry Holmes, Jerry Cooney. The one I want to talk about is the 87 fight with Leonard and Hagler, which was a major event. I live in Las Vegas. It was a monster event. For those people that may be too young to remember, I'll put a link in the show notes. You really got to take a look at some of the history on this fight, but you worked with Sugar Ray. And before this fight, Sugar Ray was in retirement. Was there any indication on your part that Ray's going to come out of retirement and he's going to pick Hagler to take this fight?
No, there wasn't, except I will tell you one story. And there aren't too many people that know this story. I've told it a couple of times to interviewers, but Ray and I were doing the Duran-Hagler fight. Ray and I were calling the fight. Hagler beats Duran. In fact, I think he stopped him. And at the end of the fight, after the fight was over and the decision was announced and all that kind of thing, Duran came over to where we were sitting and stuck his head between the ropes and said to Ray, "You can beat this guy." And I've talked to Ray about it since. I know that was the moment he said, "Okay, I think I'm going to go for this." And that was probably that was probably 6 months before the fight was even announced. And then there was an addendum to that about 2 or 3 months after that. Ray and I were doing a fight in Florida, in Miami. And it was a Hector Camacho fight. I don't remember who he was fighting. But Ray calls me up and said, hey, I chartered a boat. We're going to go have lunch up in the waterways, inland waterways somewhere. He said, meet me at this dock, So I meet him, and we're sitting up. Of course, when Ray says I'm going to charter a boat, I'm thinking it's going to be a dinghy. It was about 100-foot yacht. That's Ray. But anyway, so we're sitting up on the bow of the boat, just he and I, and we're just yakking, just talking. And Ray said, you want to know how to beat Marvin Hagler? Here's how you beat Marvin Hagler. He said, you fight, you got a flurry in the first minute of the round, and you got to have a 15-second flurry in the middle of the round, and you have to end the round with a 15-second flurry, and you'll steal the fight. And that's exactly
what he did.
Exactly what happened in the fight. And that was like a year later. Exactly what happened. He stole the fight. That fight is very controversial, and people ask me about it all the time. And they ask me what I thought Ray won the fight that night, and I still think Ray won the fight. But do I think he really beat Marvin Hagler? No, I think he stole it. Stole it because that's what judges see. They see the beginning and the end.
And you're right. It's exactly what he did. How was it for you calling that fight? Because, that was a mega fight at the time.
It's interesting because obviously I had real fondness for Ray. I met him in 1976, the Olympics, and then we became partners, a couple of years later. And he was like a little brother to me still to this day. In fact, I just heard from him today. And so we're really close. And it's really hard watching somebody you really care about, get beat up, And I saw him get beat up more than once. He doesn't show it in the ring, but there was one time I remember having to help him up the stairs of his house the day after a fight that he won. But I also had a relationship with Marvin Hagler because I had done so many of his fights and spent so much time with him. And I really liked Marvin Hagler too. A completely different guy than Ray, completely different guy. Ray was kind of a white collar guy, and Marvin very much a blue collar guy, and but a really likable and sensible and thinking, smart guy. Boxers don't get credit for being smart, and a lot of them really are. The pugs and the guys that stayed around too long and now are punchy kind of speak for everybody else. But there's a lot of really bright guys that I've come across in boxing, and they may not be book smart, but they're savvy. They have sense,
especially in their craft.
A number of athletes like that. Inner city athletes, especially, who haven't had the best of it in terms of education, but they're really savvy and smart. And Marvin was like that. So that fight would have been really difficult if I didn't know Marvin. But I also had a soft spot for Marvin. So I cared about both of them, really. So I think I could be pretty objective when it came to calling a fight. I can honestly tell you in 40 years, I haven't cared who's won a game that I've done or a fight that I've done or any event that I've done, tennis match or anything. I really do. I'm not a fan anymore. The irony about this whole business is you get into it because you're a fan. And then once you start working for a network and calling games or any sporting event, you can't be a fan anymore. You can't care who wins.
Yeah. And speaking of being a fan and calling fights, in 85, you're featured in Rocky IV calling fights on the movie screen. Did they come to you, or how did that part land for you?
Yeah, it was a fluke. Again, I told you my whole career has been a fluke. I'm not joking, Tommy. Actually, it was not my agent, but a friend of mine's agent, Steve Fiziak, who does the Kansas City Royals. It was his agent who called me and said, they're looking for somebody to do this, be the fight announcer for Rocky, for one of the Rocky movies. It was Rocky IV. And it just happened that I had like a 2-week gap in my schedule. And so I thought, well, it'll be interesting. I've never been around that crowd or that sort of thing. I'm a live television guy, so we always envisioned ourselves as riding into town, shooting the town up and leaving, and people saying, who were those guys? So like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. So I thought it'd be something different. So they did it. It was in Vancouver, British Columbia, and it was in the summer. And the scene was supposed to be winter in Moscow. So every day, and it took 2 weeks to do that one. I think it was an 18-minute sequence. And my part was only, I don't know, a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes, maybe a little more. I don't know. But that only took one day, actually. 2 days. We had to do a couple of remakes, but really one day. So for 11 days, you had to sit there. And because we were ringside, you can't, do a crossword puzzle or read a book or what. You just had to sit there in a coat and tie. It's 90 degrees in the place. And if I felt sorry for the extras because they all had to wear parkas and all because it was supposed to be wintertime and they're in the audience, So they, and every one of them, there was probably 2,000 extras and every one of them thought they were going to be the co-star of Stallone's next movie. Every one of them. But anyway, it was the most boring thing I've ever done in my life, ever. And I'm just thinking to myself, why am I doing this? What am I doing here? And on top of it all, they paid me $2,500, which, at a glance, it sounds like, okay, but it was 12 days, $2,500, I could have been flipping McDonald's,
Yeah. You need another zero on that paycheck.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end, I thought I'm never doing this again. We did literally the part that I did was literally one take, and I'm watching some of this other stuff. I mean, I don't know how much time you have, but I can tell you one quick story.
Sure. Go ahead.
So the part of the wife of the Russian fighter was played by Ingrid Nielsen, who at that time was Stallone's girlfriend. Beautiful. I think it kind of stopped there. Beautiful. Bridget Nielsen, I beg your pardon. And, dumb as a bag of rocks, So there's one scene, and if you remember the movie, you'll remember this scene. It's when the fight starts to turn and Rocky starts to beat up on Drago. And in the corner between rounds, when all this starts, Drago's manager comes up and he gets to Drago's ear right on the ring apron, and he has this 30-second monologue in Russian. In Russian. He doesn't speak Russian, but he's a character actor. You've seen this guy a million times. He's a pro, and when he finishes his diatribe, Bridget Nielsen has to stand up in the crowd, and her line is "Niet," no, that's her line. Niet. Roll the cameras. He comes up, 30 seconds, Russian, perfect, no problem. She stands up, "Niet." Cut, take two. He comes up, 30 seconds, perfect, no problem. She stands up, "Niet." Stallone went through every emotion known to man. Give me anger. Give me concern. Give me that you're upset. Give me. She couldn't. Finally, after 32 takes of him being perfect every time in a language he doesn't speak, she kicked "Niet" 32 times, and finally Stallone said, "We'll loop it." Meaning I'll do it post-production.
Right.
Don't worry about it. And I'm thinking to myself, really? Are you kidding?
And you're just sitting there.
And oh my God. So that was my taste of making movies. Now, the upshot of it all, of course, is that so now the movie comes out, and shortly after the movie comes out, a check shows up at my house for $40,000. And I'm thinking, well, obviously this is a mistake, and I didn't cash it. And 2-3 months later, another check shows up, and it's for $28,000. So I finally called them, and said, obviously there's a mistake. It's probably meant for Stallone or Talia Shire or somebody, certainly not me.
Yeah.
And they said, no, it's yours. And it turned out the way that the movie was cut, just the way they happened to cut it, and I was on camera for so many seconds, it made me a principal. So that movie, you said that was 85. So what are we now? 27 years or 25 years later. And is that right? Yeah, 25 years later.
That would be 35 years. 35 years later.
I still get checks.
You're still getting royalty. So the 2,500, the extra zeros came. It's still coming.
It's stupid. And I'm thinking to myself, if I made this much money off this movie, what is Stallone making?
Right.
Crazy. I mean, now the checks are $100, but whatever it is. But even last year, I think it was probably $1,400 worth of Stallone checks,
Stallone money. And at the top of the show, I talked about how many numerous sports you've done. And everybody out there, and I just talked to a friend of mine yesterday, and I brought your name up, and he goes, boxing commentator. And I started naming him off, and he's like, no. I'm like, yes. And for everybody out there, it's college basketball, not just boxing, French Open tennis, the Tour de France. We've done track and field. We've done swimming and diving, world gymnastics. You've been the voice for Pac-10 football, Pac-10 basketball. How have you been able to do so many sports and make it seem like you've done it forever?
I wish I really had a good answer for you. A lot of people, like baseball guys, I mentioned Steve Physiok's name, and Steve has done a lot of different sports. He does the Royals now. He and I used to do the Pac-10 and Pac-12 later. But Steve loves baseball, and doing 162 games, he loves it. That's true of the guy I mentioned earlier too, Hank Greenwald. And most baseball guys, they love baseball. And you have to do 162 games. The Giants asked me one year to do 50 games for them. And I thought, okay, it might be fun, and I get to work with Hank, and I had never done baseball. So I'd done some college baseball, but I thought my team, it's my home team, And that year, it just happened to be, it was Barry Bonds' first year. They just happened to be really good. They won 103 games that year. And about 30 games in, I'm thinking to myself, what's next? Give me something else. I mean, Jesus, I can't do this, And they only wanted 50 games from me, So I think it's just me. I think I probably am ADD, but when I was a kid, there was no such thing. So it wasn't diagnosed, but I just like doing different things all the time, even to this day, and I'm not doing as many different things now as I used to, but it just keeps me fresh. I find, because like I told you, every sport has a language, every sport has a tempo. So the preparation is different in every sport. And it's good for me now at my age. It's really good, I think, to do different things and keep yourself thinking, and that's why I always liked it. Every sport had a different rhythm, different characters in it, was produced a different way. You had somebody sitting next to you who is very different from the football guy that you have sitting next to you. And I learned a lot. I really did. I really learned a lot, and I've been so blessed with color commentators. I mean, people ask me that question all the time, and it's like, I don't even know what to say. I've never had one that I truly hated, never. And most guys who do what I do, there have been people that they just won't even have, they won't ride to the event in the same car, I've never had that. I've had some that I liked more than others, but I've been able to work with, like in tennis for years at Wimbledon and more than just Wimbledon, at the U.S. Open also. I had Billie Jean King and Arthur Ashe, two people who I put up there as highest character people I've ever been around in any walk of life, not just as color commentators, but as people. Billie I have a long history with. I've known her from the time I started in local news. She was living in Berkeley at the time. And Arthur was a one-of-a-kind guy. In figure skating, I had Scott Hamilton. In gymnastics, I had Bart Connor, and Kathy Johnson. And I've always had these, really big time people in their event sitting alongside of me. And I found them to be just wonderful people. All those people I just mentioned are great friends of mine, you know?
And speaking of those color commentators, how much time do you have to like meet with them before some of these events? Cause I know your schedule's busy going, okay, I'm here doing the Triple Crown for horse racing, and now I'm meeting these people, and okay, here we go.
Yeah, it's hard. And some of them, quite frankly, are not willing to listen, you know? And I think that's gotten more so as time has gone on. You know, it used to be that the play-by-play guy was, I don't know how to put it, the quarterback, if you will, you know? And quite frankly, we made more money than the color commentators did too. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the color commentators who make the money. The role of the play-by-play guy, and this is mostly, it's been dictated by ESPN. The role of the play-by-play guy basically is call a play and get out of the way. And then you have usually a 3-man booth, which I hate to this day. And so you've got your 2 color commentators who basically argue with each other. That's what they want. They want confrontation. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's a completely different world than it used to be. But I used to be able to go into a booth and say, like in basketball, you know, I could say, okay, look, I will take anything that's going on in the half court. After a made basket or even a missed basket, you have it all the way through the transition until they're in the half court. You know, so that kind of sets the ground rules. So, you know, your color commentator knows that's my time to talk. And that way you're not talking over each other. You know, I'm oversimplifying it, and the same with a football announcer, a football color commentator. You know, I would say, look, I'll leave you plenty of room after the play, because I'll call a play and do down and distance. And then I'll leave you'll probably have 30 seconds, you know, for a comment of some sort. And if you don't want to fill it, just don't make something up just to be talking, you know. I'll fill it if we need to, you know. But all I ask is that when they break the huddle, you get it back to me, because I want to be able to say what the formation is and who's in the game, you know. And most guys they get it, and it makes for a better broadcast. You know, I mean, my philosophy of broadcasting has always been, first, there's 2. One that Don Klein taught me, and that is that as a play-by-play guy, you are not more important than the game. The game is the important thing, and your job is to chronicle the event. That's what I do, you know. I'm just describing what I'm seeing in front of me, you know, and then I'm getting out of the way. If there's a big play, I'm getting out of the way. I'm letting the crowd take it, you know, and I'm not being hysterical, you know. Somebody once told me years ago, Dick Enberg told me this, that there's a moment in every game. And it's up to you as the play-by-play guy to know when that moment is. Sometimes it happens in the first 5 minutes of the game. And you got to know when it is, because after that, everything's downhill. You know, so you got to know. And that's why I have a real problem with announcers who fall out of the booth on every other play. Yeah. You know?
It's definitely changed.
Yeah. You know, it's so that has always been my philosophy. And the real bottom line for me is, I look upon it as 2 guys sitting on a bar stool talking about a game. Whatever the event is, doesn't matter.
That's a great analogy.
Talking about the event. And now football is a little different, because you have to do down and distance and you have to describe the play, what's happening. Basketball, I don't have to describe hardly anything, because it's television. I have to say who has the ball, but I don't have to say what side of the floor they're on, how far away from the basket they are, whether it's a jump shot or a hook shot, whether it went in or what the score is. I don't have to say any of that. It's all on the screen.
Yeah.
You know, so you can just talk about the game. You can just talk about the game, you know, and with my favorite basketball color commentators, that's exactly what we do.
A couple more things, Barry, before we wrap up. One is you're inducted in a few different Hall of Fames. One being the International Boxing Hall of Fame. The other one is I want to talk about is the NorCal Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. Yeah. I'm sure they're both dear to your heart for different reasons, but how did you feel about being nominated and being inducted into those Hall of Fames?
You know, it's funny. I always kid about the fact that I'm in 3 Halls of Fame. One is my high school. One is the Jewish Hall of Fame, and one is the Boxing Hall of Fame. And of the three, I think I might have had a 2.5 GPA in high school.
Higher in college.
I didn't go to college. Yeah, higher in college. Yeah, I went to class in high school. I'm Jewish by culture much more than I am by religion. My Irish Catholic wife knows more about Judaism than I do. And I've never been in a fight in my life, not even on the playgrounds, and I'm in the Boxing Hall of Fame. So those are my credentials for being in those 3 halls of fame. Obviously the Boxing Hall of Fame is, I appreciate that because it comes from my peers. And, I feel like I'm in some pretty select company there.
Absolutely. I think you're one of the best in the business in any sport you do. 2 more questions. One real quick is, when you look back at your career, Barry, are there some top memories, whether it's in boxing or gymnastics, that just kind of pop? These are things I remember right away.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's more about the people that I work with than it is about the events that I covered.
Okay.
I do. And I do have some of those too. I did the 7 lateral game at Cal in the big game where they knocked over the trombone player.
Yeah.
I did it at the French Open when Michael Chang won the tournament and he beat Ivan Lendl in the semifinals by serving underhand. He was cramping up and he surprised him with an underhand serve and he aced him and won a game. He probably should have, had it not have been a changeover, he would have withdrawn from the tournament and he wound up winning the tournament. I did that. I did the Triple Crown of Racing twice actually, when Affirmed won and when Seattle Slew won. I did Nadia Comaneci in the 76 Olympics, Ray Leonard in the 76 Olympics. I had a lot of big fights, when Tyson won the championship, and of course, Leonard Hagler, and the fight that you talked about, Arguello Pryor, which is the greatest fight, not only that I ever did, it was the greatest fight I ever saw. And so I had a lot of those moments, but most of my real memories are of the people that I worked with, and the hanging out, and conversations over dinner, I mentioned Arthur Ashe, and he's an interesting guy in that, we live in kind of a hail fellow well met society where, you slap your back and you're the person's best friend, Arthur was the kind of guy, it took me 3 years to get to know him. But when you get to know him, he friendship really meant a lot to him. He didn't just make friends frivolously. His friends were his friends, but his acquaintances, he had no acquaintances. And we used to, after 3 years, we did 10 years together at Wimbledon. On the middle Sunday of Wimbledon, there was no tennis. And I knew his wife too. His wife had worked at NBC when I worked there. So I actually knew her before he knew her. And my wife would always come over because she's a writer. She was a newspaper columnist and she'd cover Wimbledon when I was working. So we would go have a picnic. We would go hire a car and go to Harrods and get a picnic lunch. And we'd go have a picnic somewhere out in the country in England. And it became kind of this tradition, with Arthur and his wife and with my wife, Joan, and I. And we used to have these conversations that are some of the more lasting memories that I have in 50 years of doing this sort of thing, and about the world, I mean, 'cause, we talk about apartheid and we talk about racial things and then of course he was HIV positive from a blood transfusion when he had a heart surgery and he died of it, he told us that it was terminal on one of those picnics, and nobody, even his daughter didn't know at that time, but he trusted the fact that my wife was a newspaper columnist and she was not going to go back and write that and break a story, that the friendship was more important than that. And that's one of the most cherished memories I have, is hanging out with him, hanging out with Billy, I used to work out here on the West Coast with a guy named Petros Papadakis. There's a radio show in Los Angeles. And one of the funniest people I've ever been around. He was my football color commentator for about 6 years. And we used to go to dinner with almost the whole, not the whole crew, but the whole booth crew. It was myself and Petros, and the producer and director would go, and then our stats guy and our spotter, and it was a million laughs every time we did it. He was a bigger than life character. And those are the kinds of things I remember, it was all about the people that I worked with. And those are the lasting memories for me. If somebody jogs my mind about a particular event, I can recall it. But, people ask me all the time, what was the most exciting or what was the most interesting? And I'm hard pressed to come up with one, just because my memories are more of the associations that I had.
Yeah, which makes sense, because anytime you talk to or you hear interviews with a former coach or a former player, it's always the camaraderie. It's not the games. It's not the actual, competition that they miss. It's always the behind the scenes stuff. And for you, Barry, what's future for you? How much more you want to keep going, and what's on the horizon for you?
I don't know. I'm 80 years old, so the future, I'm not sure. I'm looking outside saying, "Hey, I'm on the right side of the lawn today." So I like working. I really do, and I have about a half a dozen people in the industry who I've told, if you ever see me start to slip, you got to let me know. Because I've always said, I want to be able to turn my back on this business before the business turns its back on me, and I beat the system to the point that I'm 80, I'm not doing nearly as much as I used to. And I'd be kidding you if I told you my phone's ringing off the hook with people offering me jobs, but it's a young man's business. So that's, it's somebody else's turn now. And, and I had a really good career. So I'm doing boxing for Showtime. And I love the people that I work with. Steve Farhood is my color commentator in boxing, and Raul Marquez. They're two of my closest friends, and I have a great boss, and I'm quite sure, unless either I get senile or the package just goes away, that they just stop doing boxing, I can probably do it as long as I'm not doddering, and I will. And I will, just because I still enjoy it. I enjoy getting on a plane and going to the event and having dinner with the crew. And, I like it, and I still think I can do it. And I still do basketball. I don't do as much as I used to, but I did about 25 games, mostly in the West Coast Conference and the Pac-12. And even that is not being quite as much fun as it used to be. The whole business has gotten much more serious than it used to be. And it's just different. And I'm not telling you for better or worse. I don't ever want to be one of those guys that says, boy, those were the good old days, because I don't really think that. I think now is the good old days, but it's changed. It's changed a lot, and the relationships between players and media, or players and broadcasters and coaches and broadcasters, has really changed. Football coaches now want to do meetings on a telephone. I don't want to do that. I want to be able to look across a room and look in the eye so I can see if you're really telling me the truth, but they're too busy for it now, So it's changed in that regard. And that was a part of the whole package for me, so I'm not enjoying it as much as I did. Now I have a basketball color commentator that I've been with. We actually grew up together in San Francisco, and we've been doing West Coast Conference basketball. We've been together now. He stopped coaching. He was a coach. Stopped coaching in 1980, and we've been together doing commentary ever since then. And, I enjoy working with him. He's a good friend, and we finish each other's sentences. We know each other so well, and most of the coaches in the league know that, and, they embrace that, So that's the fun part, and I will continue to do that. Again, until somebody tells me I can't do this anymore. I haven't done football for the last couple of years, and it's not because I haven't been offered it, but my boxing schedule is, I was working for DAZN also, which is a streaming boxing service. And so I was doing more boxing really than I wanted to. And it didn't allow me to commit to a full football schedule, because I had boxing every other week and during the football season. So I haven't done that for the last couple of years. So it's boxing and basketball, and I'll take it, I'll take it until somebody says you can't do it anymore.
Well, I can still hear the passion that you have for what you do in your voice, and you can tell you're still excited about it. And that's usually the biggest thing, because people lose their love and their passion for what they do, and you still have it. But Barry, I can't thank you enough for taking time today to be on the show, and I greatly appreciate all the insight and the stories.
Pleasure being with you, Tommy.
Everybody else, please subscribe to the show. You can do that many ways. You can go to any podcast platform that we're on out there, with just about any of them. Please go to our website, beforethelightspod.com, to get show notes, find all episode information and previous episodes. Follow us on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. Thanks for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. Until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.